used for millennia as symbols of ensnarement and deceit, webs have a certain unique appeal to them. Whereas previously discussed topics on this channel have included traits which are typically found in profusion amongst the animal kingdom, web making is solely the profession of the more micro of animal organisms. This rather distinctive trait has led spiders to become associated with entrapment and immobility, when in reality the evolution of this groundbreaking new ability in predatory tactics freed arachnids from the limited purview of archaic and restrictive hunting methods. It allowed for a much more leisurely sit-and-wait approach to hunting, ushering in an insectivorous revolution. It also allowed for a much less present hunting style, as multiple silken traps could be laid at various locations and didn't require the presence of the spider to successfully obtain prey. The practice of web spinning is quite an ancient one, having laid its roots in the Silurian period. Modern estimates place the emergence of sophisticated, fully fledged web spinning at roughly 400 million years ago, although the activities of proto-web spinners could have occurred much earlier and have simply gone undocumented in the ensuing eons. Given the extreme antiquity of this trait's evolution, much about its history and development will be undoubtedly shrouded in mystery and obscurity. Typically, the earlier a trait emerged, the more challenging it is to elucidate exactly when it was that said trait had reached its fully realized modern form. This is due to the fact that a large amount of time has passed since this hypothetical point in time and the modern day, allowing for the displacement or destruction of much of the would-be fossil record. Another thing to note about the scholarly attempts to illuminate the evolutionary history of web spinning is the fact that much of its specificities are speculative. Large shares of the details can only be gleaned from already known evolutionary facts or inferred from closely related organisms about which comparatively much more is known. This, of course, unfortunately means that much of the circumstances which led to the evolution of the marvelous and tendrillous manifestation of silken webs will remain unknown to us, or will remain unknown at least until more insightful methods of retrospective research and more scientifically advanced methods are available to the field of paleontology. Perhaps it's best if I start off outlining exactly what a web is and what they consist of. A web is a pliable and fibrous yet surprisingly strong structure of spider silk which has been spun by a spider and stretched over or about a stable surface. Spider silk itself is a proteinous kind of fiber which can be produced by all species of spider currently known to modern science. It typically has adhesive qualities which is central to its ability to carry out many of its more sinister uses. The silk used to produce the webs can often be laced with the pheromones produced by the spiders, acting as a sort of mate-attracting substrate or femme fatale lure. The silk itself is also a biopolymer, an unbroken chain of repeating units of complex organic molecules such as amino acids. A fascinating feature of the silk used to produce webs is that they principally consist of two very different components. A more solid crystalline structure, which is formed from the naturally occurring secondary structures of the folding amino acid chains known as beta sheets, and a more flexible, simplistic component of linear chains of unraveled amino acids which do not coalesce into more complex, stable secondary structures. The conglomeration of these two components lend spider silk some of its more fantastical material properties. Various other compounds also included within the spider silk bestow it with some much needed qualities that allow it to weather harsh environments. Dedicated protein groups attract and hold onto water molecules, which allow a spider's web to maintain a high level of ambient moisture, preventing potential frailty caused by drying out. Other inorganic compounds present within the silk allow it to maintain a relatively high concentration of free-floating hydrogen ions. This has the net effect of slightly acidifying the silk and helping to stave off pathogenic colony growths and fungal infiltration. Now, before we get to the evolution part of web making, I just want to remark on some of the more interesting qualities and uses of webs, to perhaps allow for a better insight onto why webs may have evolved in the first place. One fact that many people are unaware of is that the sole function of spider webs is not simply for the use of predation, there exist other employments for this substance, which would make perfect sense. Spiders being able to produce silk and essentially create their own structures in almost any environment is a pretty massive advantage. The versatility and breadth of use that being able to spin webs would grant a creature goes without being said. Its vast potential implementations largely being limited to the lack of imagination and cognitive complexity of the arachnid quote-unquote mind. I think if this trait had evolved in a much larger, more tactile organism with much greater intelligence, we'd have seen some incredible uses of this ability. And I don't mean to disparage spiders too much, but thinking of all the wasted potential of granting some of nature's smallest and dullest creatures with a boon like this is tragic indeed. But enough rambling. Allow me to list for you some of the more varied uses of webs that spiders have been documented employing. First and foremost, and perhaps most usefully, spiders can actually consume their own silk. Now, this isn't necessarily the most energy efficient way to go about sustaining oneself. After all, there is considerable waste involved for a spider in the process of producing its own silk in the first place, which would invalidate the idea of self-sustainability. In a similar fashion to how the total energy present in any given level of a trophic pyramid decreases the further up the pyramid you move, the spider would receive comparatively less energy from consuming their own silk than they would have invested into producing said silk initially. Energy would have been lost in maintaining the spider's own homeostatic internal environment and ensuring all of its critical tissues and organs are maintained. Energy would also have been wasted through heat exchange with the environment and also through the use of physical movement. The very act of producing the silk itself requires the synthesis of many microstructures, all of which must have an energy investment to be created. But at the very least, it does have the desirable side effect of cutting down on overall waste. In the situation that the spider finds that the previously chosen location for a web was not as much of an insect hotspot as it once thought, again I use the word thought very loosely, then the spider can salvage some of the calories it wasted in producing the silk and painstakingly weaving it into a membranous silky trap. A completely separate use of webs is for the extension of tactile awareness around the spider itself in a given area. Functioning in a similar way to a cat's whiskers, although much more disembodied, the spider's webs allow for the transmittance of vibrations and disturbances inflicted on the web itself to be reverberated throughout the body of the web, eventually making its way back to the spider. Although I'm not sure if this one really counts as a use of webs per se. It seems like it's more so just the reality that the spider happens to be sitting on the web and feels some of its arse hairs vibrating when something stirs nearby. Could have just as easily been a fart, to be honest. However, this can inform a spider about the immediate goings-on in quite a large area around it. Webs, being composed of thin, delicate material which have been stretched over relatively large distances, can transmit vibrations quite well. The most common reason for a web being disturbed is often that the web has been successful in capturing prey, alerting the spider that it's time to feast. Alternatively, the web's disturbances could be due to an intruder or other similarly concerning presence on the web, warning the spider about an imminent threat. Realistically, the web detection system doesn't transmit much specific information to the spider itself. It is quite binary, informing the spider that either something has just collided with the surface of the web, or nothing has collided with the surface of the web as of yet. Although this does provide an invaluable service to the spider, and I suppose it grants it a sort of spider sense, spiders can also make use of their webs as a mode of travel. Unfortunately, I'm intimately familiar with this utility of the spider web, having been jump-scared many a time by the sudden realization that a spider has been slowly lowering itself onto the bridge of my nose for quite some time now. The small, fragile body of the spider would not lend itself well to some of the more rapid de-escalation tactics employed by other members of the animal kingdom, such as the grey squirrel. So, the spider can instead slowly descend towards the ground from an overhanging tree limb or an unsuspecting person's bedroom ceiling by hanging itself off of a surface, and slowly ejecting a long line of web out from behind it as the comparatively greater force of gravity gently pulls it towards the ground. But, by far the most disconcerting use spiders can have for their webs is the behavior that's known in the arachnologist community as ballooning. This practice consists of the spider in question clambering up to as high an altitude as it can muster in an area in which it is exposed to high wind speeds, then flipping over and turtling itself on its back so it effectively becomes belly up, and then slowly releasing fine threads of silk in the direction of the blowing wind. Eventually, one of the fine silk threads will catch a particularly strong current and generate enough lift to propel the spider into the air and allow it to ride the air current. This form of usually long-distance movement can carry the spider to startlingly distant locations, with some observations in the hundreds of kilometers. To make matters worse, it seems that this is not a rare behavior at all, with many species of spider having been witnessed traveling this way, including some of the larger, nastier species of spider you might have hoped would have been too large to hang glide across the land. Not so, it would seem. Well, with all these terrific applications of spider webs, their evolution seems a no-brainer. And I would concur. They certainly seem to be one of the more inventive evolved traits out there. But with the warnings that were mentioned earlier in the video in mind, I'll explain the most widely accepted explanation of spiderweb evolutionary history at the moment. The history of web evolution begins with the burgeoning of the crowning achievement of another branch of the insect world, powered flight. The theory goes that spiders, having previously preyed on the ancestors of this newly winged clade of insects, had to adapt to their newly having acquired flight. The previous tactic of ambush hunting was no longer as feasible on prey items that could simply immediately fly in the opposite direction of whatever threat they were faced with. And if you yourself have ever attempted to ambush a wandering fly that may have absent-mindedly entered your room, you know they can be quite flighty, so to speak. This necessitated the development of a novel trait which allowed the spiders to resume their predation of these flying insects. Thus, the practice of spinning adhesive web traps from silk was born. The webs were strong enough to resist powerful breezes and rain, but also elastic enough to withstand the high-impact force of an insect flying directly into it. Although far from being perfectly functional in all climates, webs were hardy enough to persist for long periods of time without succumbing to the environment and degrading. These initial high-altitude webs would have been quite simplistic in their structure and probably not very large at all, just effective enough to catch early flying insects who were themselves only beginning to fly and were equally unsophisticated in their methods. But as time marched on, the prey items of spiders became increasingly capable flyers and developed much more robust mechanisms of flight, and also became more agile, able to evade the primitive webs of earlier spiders. The spiders then metaphorically felt the evolutionary impetus to catch up and were selected for their ability to produce more and more ingenious web structures and hunting tactics to catch the new generation of more competent insect pilots. This cycle of back and forth retaliatory evolution can be deduced due to the large breadth of spider webs and web spinning behaviors which can be observed amongst existing spider species today. Each new innovation having been developed in response to another innovation having occurred in their prey item. This eventually led to the diversification of many different web types and prey catching methods. The webs of modern species of spider are the result of repetitive improvements on earlier, more primitive designs relative to the specialized niche that the spider in question inhabited. Seemingly, the reason for spiderweb evolution is effectively that they were the perfect counter to a prey item which had acquired a method for evading all attempts developed up until that point for catching them. So effective a solution for evading predation was the development of flight that spiders were forced to metaphorically come up with an equally groundbreaking method of hunting them. Had spiders not measured up to this challenge and started their streak of silk-stricken spinning, they would have found themselves in a sticky situation indeed.